As I've said, India, the government of India, needs to take this matter with the utmost seriousness.
I think we need to see more facts. The Prime Minister hasn't provided any facts. He provided a statement, and I will just emphasize that he didn't tell me any more in private than he told Canadians in public.
What I'm deeply concerned about is that amongst many members of the Sikh community, there are folks that have been warned about credible threats against their lives, and that despite those threats being made aware, they were not protected, and there wasn't a clear plan of protection.
Leaders in Ottawa today reacting a day after the Prime Minister announced he has credible intelligence the Indian government is potentially linked to the murder of a Sikh leader, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, in BC this year. India tonight is rejecting that allegation, with the Ministry of External Affairs saying in a statement that reads in part, allegations of Government of India's involvement in any act of violence in Canada are absurd and motivated. Such unsubstantiated allegations, the statement goes on to read, seek to shift the focus from Khalistani terrorists and extremists who have been provided shelter in Canada and continue to threaten India's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Washington Post, however, is reporting this evening that Canada's allies rejected an ask to condemn the killing. We reached out to Global Affairs for our response to that claim. They have not yet provided us with a comment, but the U.S. National Security Council's spokesperson, John Kirby, made these comments to CNN not long ago.
We believe in order to determine how credible they are, there needs to be a thorough, transparent, comprehensive investigation. Prime Minister Trudeau has called for that investigation, so we are going to watch and see how Canada moves forward on this. Certainly well within their capacity to do this. We have no doubt about that. We urge India as well to participate and cooperate in that investigation.
So how unprecedented are the allegations, the revelation of them, and where do Canada-India relations go from here? With me this evening to talk about that, our former national security advisors, Richard Fadden and Vincent Rigby. Hello to you both. Thank you very much for making the time for this. Mr. Fadden, I'll start with you, and I actually want to pick up where John Kirby left off. I found the initial comments he made there about what is necessary for the U.S. to determine the credibility of these allegations. Canada is saying they are credible. Do you take anything from the fact that our allies have not yet come to the same exact conclusion?
Well, not really, because each country is going to pursue its own interest, broader interest, not just intelligence, but economic, political, and other. We've been thinking about this for quite a while now. We've been dealing with an investigation, both the criminal investigation in Surrey and the more political one with CSIS. I'm not sure we shared every step of the way with our allies, so I think it's not an unreasonable response. Having said that, if we don't get our allies to support this, either publicly or privately, Canada's not going to be able to do a great deal to move India. And I think the greatest thing we can aspire to in the short term or the medium term is to get India not to do this again.
The statement, I think, Mr. Rigby, is emblematic of the fact that the last time we had convened, the three of us, let's say, was to talk about China, very clearly labeled by the West as an adversary in many cases. India is not the same. In fact, it's a strategic ally in sort of the West's positioning with China. How does that further complicate what's happening right now between our two countries from where you sit?
Well, I think it really does complicate the picture considerably. I think we normally think of hostile state actors as China, as Russia, as Iran, as North Korea. So here's a country that is a democracy, is a partner in many respects to Canada, a fellow Commonwealth country that is maybe not a hostile state actor per se, but these are not benign activities. These are hostile activities, if indeed they were carried out by the government of India. But these kinds of activities come in all different shapes and sizes, and if this means that the public inquiry that's looking into Chinese foreign interference activities looks at some of these broader categories and looks also at other state actors, I don't think that's a bad thing.
The two of you have been in this field and in intelligence for decades. When you saw Mr. Fadden, the Prime Minister, get up in the House of Commons to make these allegations public in the way that he did, how did you interpret that? Like, were you surprised that that actually happened?
Was I surprised that India might have been involved in some active foreign interference? No. That it was involved in extrajudicial killing? Yes. The Indians have been mucking about in Canada for quite a while now. And various governments, plural, have done a variety of things, but clearly not enough to stop them. So my initial reaction was, you know, what's happening in India? This is really more than they usually do, I think. then more broadly, I thought, this is a further example of foreign interference in this country, which I think remains a significant issue. And I still don't think that we're taking it seriously, given the breadth of activity that it really puts our sovereignty at risk. And then I thought about the international aspect of this. We have a lot of Canadians of Indian descent here. There are a lot of other countries that are in the same category. If they could do that here, they could do it somewhere else. So by the time you put all this into a sort of a bowl and mix it all up, you have an issue of considerable concern. And I don't think we've seen the end of it. But I also don't see, and I think it's important to say this, that we're going to have the rough equivalent of a verdict in a Canadian criminal trial. I just don't think it's going to happen. We're going
Why not?
Because if indeed an agent of the Indian state is involved in this, the odds are any planning and organization and operational control took place in India. Given what the Indians have said, there is no way the RCMP or anybody else from Canada is going to be allowed access to any of them. So if you can't have that kind of evidentiary pursuit, you're not going to get anything in front of a Canadian court. And if you're not getting anything before a Canadian court, the pleas of Mr. Singh, who I think are very legitimate for full justice and accountability, I think it's going to be very elusive.
Do you think that's also true, Mr. Rigby?
I think that's the case, and I think that even if we have hard intelligence on the Canadian side, putting that into a court of law and being able to use that is not going to be easy. So you've kind of got from both ends of the spectrum here, having access to intelligence in India, but then having your hands on the intelligence in Canada, but this intel to evidence conundrum of actually putting it into a court. CSIS or whoever might be responsible for gaining that intelligence does not want to expose methodology, techniques, tradecraft in an open court. This is a perennial problem for CSIS. Dick knows better than me. He ran the organization for a long time, but it's really, really, really tough.
If I could follow up with you on that point, and both of you actually, Mr. Rigby, you first. We know now from the Public Safety Minister yesterday that the head of CSIS, alongside the National Security Advisor, the role that both of you occupied, traveled in multiple trips, he said, to India. Is that in any way a normal activity, or what does that tell you?
No, I don't think that's a normal activity. I mean,
in an
national security
like
and intelligence advisors and directors of CSIS travel all the time. But if there's indeed multiple trips to go to India to talk about this issue, I highly doubt they were going to talk based on a hunch or a gut feeling. They must have something. Now, it's very interesting the way the Prime Minister made his statement in the House of Commons yesterday, which is basically we have credible allegations potentially linking Indian state agents to this killing. So the wording was a little vague, I would say, and it made it sound almost that they didn't necessarily have a smoking gun. And I think Dick and I would both agree you rarely get a smoking gun in these circumstances. But how much intelligence they have, it's difficult to really find out. And I have a feeling that's perhaps why the United States and other countries are saying, well, we don't know absolutely 100% for sure what's happened here. But the fact that the National Security Intelligence Advisor and the Director of CSIS would go over and talk to their counterparts in India suggests that this is pretty serious and they've got something.
So what happens now if in fact that they do have that something, which I think is a fair assumption to make given the fact that the Prime Minister got up in the House of Commons to make that statement yesterday, Mr. Fadden, and if you don't think it's going to be necessarily cut and dry in court, where does it go from here?
Well, I think we're at a disadvantage because we haven't seen the evidence. But presuming that it's pretty comprehensive, I think the Cabinet's going to have to sit down and consider what we're going to do with two things. One, our relationships with India, and I think they're going to be pretty frosty for a while. And two, what are we going to do with this further example of foreign interference? A couple of people have suggested that Justice Hogue should take this up and pursue it right away and see what she can make of it. I think that's a mistake. There will be too many cooks in the kitchen rather. And I think it's really important to allow the RCMP and CSIS to pursue this independently without further interference. But I think the key now is going to be, what, if anything, are we going to do to make the point to the Indians that we're very, very unhappy? And then I think we have to do something with the diaspora. I mean, they're not the only diaspora in this country that is threatened. A number of people have argued, Mr. Singh amongst others, that the government should take steps to protect members of the Sikh community who are threatened. Part of the difficulty that CSIS had, I know from experience, and I also think the police have, is most threats are general. There's no time, there's no place. You cannot protect anybody and everybody all at the same time. So if the government of Canada has evidence that a particular individual is threatened at a particular point in time, they should bloody well do something about it. But most threats are way more general. So we're going to have to, I think, look at the underlying issue, develop new relationships with the communities. Most of our relationships now with these diaspora communities are relatively transactional. We need to get underneath this and try and find a way to improve communication so that we can do something.
Last word to you, Mr. Rigney, on that very subject, and I'll preface it by saying I spoke to somebody who's a very close friend of the individual who was killed in June today on my radio program, who was among, he said, 5 people who INSET, a division of the RCMP, approached prior to the murder that happened in June, months and months before, and said exactly what Mr. Fadden just laid out. Essentially, there is a more general threat, and we feel like your safety could be in peril. And then a few months later said, actually, we now think the threat has been resolved. And Mr. Najjar felt as though that was not the case for him, and ultimately that ended up proving true. So they felt there was this big interim period where they were sort of left to deal with it on their own. Do you think that I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, it's difficult to say because I don't have access to exactly what the RCMP may have said or what CSIS may have said. If these individuals are getting conflicting messages, one minute there's a high level of threat, next minute there's not such a high level of threat, they're going to base that on the information that they have at any given time. But I can understand why certain individuals would go, okay, well, what is it? Why is it less of a threat now versus the way it was 3 days ago? And more than anything else, what am I supposed to do at the end of the day? Do I not leave my house? Do I lock myself in the basement? Do I not travel overseas? Do I not get on a plane? You have to ask those questions. But Dick's 100% right, and we've both been in this situation. I remember being in that situation as an NSIA. You can't protect every single Canadian in Canada or overseas for that matter. And so it's a case-by-case judgment call as to how much protection you can provide. So hopefully we'll get to the bottom of just what was said to this individual and what happened at the end of the day.
Okay, I have to leave our discussion there. I really appreciate your analysis and insights this evening. Thank you so much.
Good to be here.
Vincent Rigby and Richard Fadden, 2 former national security advisors to the Prime Minister. We're going to get into this subject a little later with